What's it mean to be a loving father? That's a real issue for me. I'm a grown man. I have three wonderful sons who are all adult now, and I want to be a really good dad. I want to learn all the skills I need to make a family that is warm and loving and supportive. What's it mean to be a loving daughter or a loving son? And what's that look like? What do loving family members do? How much would you do? How much would you give up for your date? I mean, would you move? Would you move away from your family? Would you give up your friends? Would you change schools or change jobs? Should you ask your date to do that? So these are some of the questions that come up in Jhumpa Lahiri's The Namesake, which are one of the reasons I think it's such an interesting novel for us to read. I think all of us participate in families. I think families are very complex. Um, and one of the ways that readings serve us is to give us other people's experiences so we don't have to do it ourselves. I mean, this is one of the great achievements of Western culture. We can read other stories and use them as guideposts or as warnings to the stories that we write for ourselves. That's I think a big theme of this class, and one of the payoffs for all of the work that you guys are involved in. Jhumpa Lahiri's The Namesake, I think, was first published in 2003. The book that you're looking at is probably the 2004 version. It's an easy read. I don't think it's full of Lahiri is the last name, and Jhumpa is how we say her first name. The Namesake is the title of the book. It's a novel. That's what we call these long stories. Long, complex stories with stories. And interestingly enough, we could even say it's a historical novel. And we could say that because one of the things, here's the book, looks like this. You can get it at libraries. You might have bought it already. And you certainly can get it on Amazon. I think there's copies for $5, $7. One of the things about The Namesake, very popular book, it's in almost every library. I say historical novel because if you look at the chapter titles, you can see some of them actually put the date on there. Just like Brokeback Mountain gave us some heads up about dates. She wove them in there. Here too, Lahiri says 1968, 1971. She wants us to think about the story of the Ganguly family in relationship to real historical events. So when authors put out the dates, they're inviting us to think about what else is going on in the world in 1968, 1969, the Summer of Love, hippies, the sexual revolution. What else is going on? I think the last date, I think she goes on through the 80s and so on and so forth. Gogol was born in 68. I was born in 61. So this is very much, this is set around the time frame of my lived life. So the times are very familiar. I love in what chapters? I think chapter 5, Gogol goes to college, and he goes to Yale, and Lahiri knows New Haven because she's talking about shops and places that are familiar to any of us who live and know New Haven. So we could say it's a historical novel as in terms of genre. What's it about? The short version. This is my number one question. What's there? Well, it's the story of a family. More importantly, it's the story of an immigrant family. The story of Ashok and Ashima. They moved from Calcutta to Boston. They are in an arranged marriage. We get a glimpse of an arranged marriage. They are Bengali. Bengali is the name of a language. It's also the name of a region in South India. So they are Indian immigrants. And Gogol, also known as Nikhil, is a first generation American of immigrant parents. So the story starts at his birth. His father dies in chapter 7. Spoiler alert. Loses his virginity. He has a relationship with a beautiful blonde. He breaks up with her. Then he marries another, a different woman, Mushumi, in the later chapters, and then that marriage flies apart. So it's a story of this young man and his struggle knowing who he is and how to be in this American culture when he comes from parents of a different culture. So this immigrant story is a very popular one in the American experience. So many of us come from other places. All of those of you who are from immigrant families or bicultural, I might talk about that. You speak one language at home, speak another language here. I think it's a useful book to read, in that I think some of your own experience may be reflected or represented in the book, or some of your difference may be very, very different. It can be very, very there's no trauma, for example, in this story. And so many people come to the United States out of trauma, out of the earthquake, or out of the regime change, or out of, so there's no trauma in this immigrant experience, but there is lots of trauma in many of our immigrant experiences. Holocaust survivors, all these Germans and Poles who came to America after World War II, having survived World War II. Well, there's different elements of that experience. They didn't really come willingly. They came, and by the way, Ashima doesn't really come willingly either. She marries Ashok. You read all about that in the first chapter, chapter 1. But I don't think she would have ever chosen to move to the States. At the end of the book, how does she reconcile her own life, her American children, and her Bengali home, her Bengali past, her Bengali extended family? These are real interesting questions. How couples relate to extended families, how important that is. That's really different in different families. I have a close relationship with my sister, but I have no extended relationship with my brothers for all kinds of interesting and psycho reasons. But not everybody is in good stead with their extended family. And then for some of us, they're our lifeblood. They're everything to us. So this is an interesting read for you guys for all of those reasons. That being said, I don't expect many of you have the 10 hours to sit down and read it chapter by chapter by chapter by chapter. So what do you do in a time frame that is a semester, when you got all this other work to do, when this is the last thing that you want to put aside? How can you read a whole novel in a college class without going crazy? Couple options, couple hints. One thing people do is they just bluff. They don't read it and look at it. And those people end up getting screwed. If the novel's important, and this novel is in a class, and you just don't give it any attention and you kind of slide by, you're going to take hits in your understanding in the final of the class and in your experience, your learning experience. So when you get a novel or a big long book in a class, this one or in your future, you can't just throw up your hands. That being said, you can be strategic, which is to say, rather than thinking this as a beach read for the summer, think of this as, how can this be a tool for me for all of the things I have to do in the class? How can I use it strategically? Beginnings, endings, and tactical reads. So, I think the beginning of this book is really important. In fact, it foreshadows everything. The very first page, Ashima is trying to mix this little snack that she knows from home. She mixes it, she adds onions. Sounds awful to me, but she mixes it, she tastes it, and it's just not right. She can't quite make the Bengali, the Indian food, with American ingredients. And boy, that's the theme of the whole book. You can't quite make a family in America just like it was back home. the ingredients aren't right, aren't complete. And so that's always reading the first few pages, the first chapter even, gives you a strong sense of the tone of the book, how the narrator sounds, the kind of language, some of the issues that come up. It's not going to go through the whole plot, but it is going to give you a really good glimpse so that in a class, in a conversation, in a paper even, you're not speaking from complete ignorance about the world of the book. You're speaking from at least you've tasted some. You probably won't get away with just reading that first chapter, but it's a really smart technique. Okay, how can we make you read this when you could just watch the movie? I mean, that's the discussion board question, and it's a really good question. I think it's a real world question. Why do we read when we can watch? And rather than answering that, I have some pretty strong feelings. I mean, I'm an English professor, but I have some really strong feelings about that. Partly for the work that we're doing, right? You're going to have to write a paper and make an argument in this class. So reading's a part of that. As your writing coach, if you want to be a good writer, reading is one of the best things that helps you manipulate your own words for all kinds of interesting, actually cognitive reasons. But I kind of invite you to do that. So the movie exists. You can get it on Amazon Prime. You can get it on Apple. I think it's $3 or $4. I encourage you to get it and watch it. It's a good date movie. It's about 2 hours long, and it's a good movie. And happily, it's very, very close to the book. So one of the advantages of watching the movie is it gives you a real good overview. You find out what happens, what's the plot, who are the characters, you get familiar with the names. It's a hard thing about this book is that Ashok, Ashima, Mushimi, Nikhil, the words, the names are confusing. You have to train yourself in this new foreign language of the novel. So that's a good reason to watch the book. People use Wikipedia. Google Namesake, and you'll see a pretty good plot summary that'll give you a hint of what goes on and what goes down. And as a strategic reader, you can say, okay, if I care about breakups, if I want to write about breakups, what's a healthy breakup, or what's a bad way to break up, or breakups are part of love. That'd be a great paper to write about how to break up. Well, are there breakups? He breaks up twice. He breaks up with Maxine and he breaks up with Mushimi. There's 2 breakups in this book. It's a great book to read about breakups, the wrong way to do it, the right way to do it, and so on and so forth. So I could use the Wikipedia, I could use the movie to see how does Gogol break up, and then I could kind of know it's someplace in the middle that she gets rid of Maxine. In fact, it happens in chapter 6. Chapter 6 is a great chapter. If I had to read one other chapter, I'd go there. In chapter 5, Gogol goes to college, so it's all about Gogol at Yale. Chapter 6 is he's 27 years old, and he has his first sort of real substantial relationship, which is really interesting in so many ways. Maxine is rich. Is it okay for a middle class or a lower middle class person to date a really, really rich person? How many of you think so? What about class difference, right? What about upper and lower classes? It's a fantasy that we all get a rich sugar daddy or sugar mama for a date, but does it work? And you get a chance to actually see a really good example of that in chapter 6. So that's a couple. If I were to be strategic with you, I might say look at 1, look at 6. Is there another chapter or another event that you want to read? So you need to be real world about the Namesake. There's no lit journal this week. You get 1 lit journal, and you can pick it from anywhere in the book. And I have to say, I would say that like more than half of the students in this class in previous years have used this book as part of their final. So they found it really useful to talk about dimensions of love that they care about or that matter to them. So, but I don't know that all those 50% have used it, read it thoroughly. I know. So you've got this week and next week, 2 weeks to sort of get through whatever you're going to do with the Namesake. And I encourage you to look for those interesting issues and interesting scenes. to read strategically bits well, as opposed to feeling like you have to get through the whole thing, and also to freely dip in, as opposed to sitting down and working your way through and surviving the boring parts. Give yourself permission to be tactical and strategic with however many hours you decide to devote to this fascinating book. All right, guys, look for me next week with some difficulties and also a lot more talk. I think next week we'll really get into the final paper. Again, we'll use the namesake as an example, or how I might use one scene to talk about a dimension that I care about. Blending family cultures. How do we deal with? I mean, I'm married to a Jew. And I'm about it. My father was a Christian pastor. I mean, talk about Christmas and Hanukkah nightmares. A lot of our families have to deal with these very different blending of traditions. And how do we do that? And is there information or warnings in the namesake to help us? Have a great week. Take good care of yourselves. See you next time.